The following preview was begrudgingly approved for all audiences.
You're listening to Elevator Music.
Welcome to Forward Thinking. I'm Ricky Volante, and I'm joined by my co-host, two-time NBA champion, David West. Thanks for joining me, David.
What up, what up? We'll be hosting like this every week from our home offices to discuss and welcome those challenging the status quo, do social good, and bring about positive change in the world. And we'll also be digging into sports a little bit.
The show will be divided into 4 uneven quarters, concluding with our star guest each week. In this episode, that will be the amazing and unfiltered Soledad O'Brien. But before we get to Soledad, we're going to be discussing HBO's The Scheme and the current state of college basketball recruiting. And of course, we're going to give you a quick sneak peek into the Professional Collegiate League, or the PCL, set to launch next summer to challenge the NCAA's stranglehold on college basketball. We'll also be joined by the PCL's CMO, Wendell Haskins, who recently joined us in this crazy venture. Lastly, I want to give a big shout out to Rafa Hernandez-Brito, who will be producing the show with me each week.
And we hope that you all enjoy every episode, including this first one of Forward Thinking. Don't hesitate to reach out to us on Twitter, Instagram, or by email, and check us out at the PCLeague.com/forwardthinking for more.
So next we're going to talk a little bit about The Scheme, talking about Christian Dawkins, the Adidas hoop scandal, college basketball coaches. For those of you that don't know, essentially the crux of the scandal was for money flowing from runners or agents to college coaches and to college players, and ultimately portraying the institutions as victim institutions because they players and these agents that were working with them had represented these athletes as eligible student athletes. And so that's sort of a quick synopsis of this for those of you that aren't aware. It was on HBO if you want to check it out. But wanted to talk a little bit today with you, David, about college recruiting in general. You've experienced this as a player, as an AAU coach, and now as the COO of the PCL. And what's your take on the state of college basketball recruiting?
Well, I think what was highlighted in the scheme and the sort of the underbelly that exists, I think it's nothing that none of us were surprised about. I think we all knew that this world exists, and I wasn't the caliber of athlete that would have warranted the under the table type stuff. But you do know it's there. I've coached AAU for almost 15 years now, and being in the grassroots world, you know that there are people and bad apples in the bunch, just like there are in other sports. The problem, I think, though, is that when you try to broad stroke the entire issue, so not all recruiting and not all schools and all of these coaches are out participating. It's just the ones that are making the decision to roll the dice. For the most part, you have, from the athlete's perspective, guys are just looking for that next step. And, athletes and their families looking for that next opportunity. And sometimes a coach presents a better opportunity than the other. The issue, obviously, is that when a system that intentionally doesn't compensate the player, you end up, with this underbelly. You end up with guys having to do things under the table, guys trying to finagle this coach or that coach, and create opportunities for players that are outside of the confines of the rules. So it's a very complicated space. It's always been complicated. I don't think that the world that was exposed is a world that nobody thought didn't exist.
Yeah, it's incredible to me, again, that the institutions and the coaches, to some extent, were almost painted as victims through this. I mean, specifically...
Of course.
Yeah. The DOJ and the FBI, created the term victim institution, which was unbelievable that you could in any way, shape, or form say that throughout all of this, that Louisville was the victim. The school that during this period had the highest generated revenue of any college basketball program in the country. Not to mention a national championship mixed in there. So, I think that what we've continued to see, because, as of today, we had a handful of assistant coaches get fired. Book Richardson's the only one that has served time in prison. As of right now, Christian Dawkins is on appeal. Jim Gatto's on appeal. Both of them have been sentenced. But so it's incredible to me to think that these institutions and these players, or that the institutions were victims and that the players were not. I mean, again, it's a virtue of the system. It's a virtue of the fact that because these players cannot be directly compensated like almost any other college student that's not an athlete, that because they're limited in that way, in a capitalistic market that's generating college basketball about $3 billion a year, college in general about $13 billion a year, it would be incredibly naive to think that someone is not going to try to take advantage of that system. Next up, we're going to talk about the PCL, or the Professional Collegiate League. The PCL was formed originally by myself, Andy Schwartz, and Keith Sparks. Next, we were joined by David West as our COO, my co-host. Most recently, by Wendell Haskins, our Chief Marketing Officer. And ultimately, the PCL is college sports reimagined. It's a form of college sports that will allow athletes to receive salaries while also receiving scholarships. It'll be a little bit different because our athletes are not going to be representing their institutions that they attend, but rather will be playing for teams in a totally separate ecosystem, which is the PCL. We're going to have 8 teams in the first season, all up and down the East Coast. Going north to south, those cities are going to be Philadelphia, Baltimore, Washington, D.C., Richmond and Norfolk, Virginia, Raleigh and Charlotte, North Carolina, and Atlanta, Georgia. The players will receive salaries between $50,000 to $150,000, in addition to the scholarships that they receive to institutions in the cities that they play or online programs that they can attend. Additionally, they'll be able to go to community colleges, accredited vocational programs, and trade schools. We will be launching about 14 months from now in June 2021. And so with that, Wendell, again, most recent addition to the team. You joined us officially, I believe, about 10 days ago. What drew you to the PCL?
Yeah, Ricky, thank you, man. It's a pleasure to be here. What drew me to the PCL, man, is I honestly think this is part of the evolution of sport. If there's anything that you can ever do someone to help them, is to give them the opportunity, A, to make some money, or I should say, A, to be educated, and then B, to make money. So those two things in tandem meant a lot to me, and I think this is really a part of the evolution of American sport, to allow people to receive their education first and foremost, and then have the opportunity to get paid. I think that's what we all want to be in a position to do, is to earn a living and feed ourselves, provide for our families, and certainly we can see what's happened over the course of years in American sport, and a lot of problems that derive from people not being able to either A, provide or make a living wage for themselves while they're in college. So, I'm an avid sports fan. I love basketball. I've been a basketball fan all my life. Grew up playing basketball, baseball, and just about all sports. I've worked in sports and entertainment, just about all my life. And I just thought this was an amazing opportunity. And I think this is something that really presents the kind of where sports is going. And I'm excited to be a part of that.
Yeah, something for me that in college sports that's talked about but uncomfortably talked about is the racial composition when it comes to the demographics of college sports. In particular, college basketball, where 58% or so of the athletes at the Division I level, particularly those with scholarships, are Black. When you factor in the percentages of starters versus bench players, the percentage goes considerably higher. Then you juxtapose that with the coaches and administrators, college coaches, Division I men's basketball, 78% are white. Athletic directors, I believe, are 82% white. Assistant athletic directors are 85% white. Or excuse me, associate athletic directors are 85% white, and assistant athletic directors are 87% white.
Man, that was some buckets right there, man.
I mean, Wendell, you come from, the PGA of America. Don't want to get that wrong again. Where part of what you oversaw was diversity and inclusion initiatives for the PGA of America. When you hear those numbers, does it surprise you or not?
Well, if you want me to spew out the diversity numbers in professional golf, there's more business. So what you just presented would actually be significant progress in the PGA system.
Wow.
So and it's all relative, but certainly those disparities are across all sports. I mean, we know. I know. I mean, I have friends and relatives that work in professional football, and those numbers are also very concerning and disappointing. So we all have issues across all sports, but particularly in basketball and football, where you have a large majority of the players that are Black, it's even more concerning that you have so few people in either management, front office, and coaching that are given the opportunities to do those things. And a friend of mine in professional basketball once said, the white guys are lucky because they recycle the white guys. You can go from one job to another and stay on TV and get, all kinds of jobs, but it doesn't happen like that for people of color, unfortunately. So, to be able to put people in a position to, join the workforce, get paid for what they love to do and what they have expertise in, I'm all for it.
Yeah, and I think one of the most exciting things for me that originally drew me to the PCL, originally the HPL, and something that's really excited me in the few weeks that we've gotten to work together is the opportunity to sort of rewrite the narrative of how people perceive college athletes, which again, based off the numbers, typically tend to be Black college athletes, and even beyond that, Black male college athletes. I think there's a narrative opportunity here for us to really reestablish and redefine what people think about. And it's not just going to be, athletes looking for a payday, athletes getting in trouble off the field. The old AD from Taylor Branch's work, The Shame of College Sports, talking about, either the animals running the zoo or guys wanting nothing but chains and rims, all those different things. We have an opportunity, I think, to totally rewrite those perceptions.
Sure. And it didn't hurt that you're a Richmond guy too, so that's where my roots are. So that is
not the Richmond connections, much to David's chagrin, which I still think go back a little bit to his playing days at Xavier. But David, a question you and I get asked a lot, I think in almost any setting that we go out into: why would a blue chip prospect say yes to the PCL when you have Coach K at a Duke, Roy Williams at a UNC, Calipari at a Kentucky also knocking on their door?
I mean, the easiest way to answer that would be we offer something different. We offer a professional approach, a professional pathway, sooner rather than later. For us, we're not going to disguise or hide our motive or our intention, which is to professionalize the athlete and to begin to help him create the skills and build the faculty to be a professional athlete sooner rather than later. Use the 8 months, if it's a one and done player who's directly tied with us, use those 8 months to directly invest in them as potential or future pro athletes. I think that's the best way to put it.
Absolutely. I think that, the idea that that college athletes, specifically in this context, college basketball players, should have to forego one of the most valuable portions of their career. Especially for those. David, you're 15-year guy in the NBA. You're the dream case. But how many of your college teammates, how many of your former professional teammates that didn't have that type of career, that had to forego a huge earning potential by virtue of not being paid in college?
Right. Yeah. I mean, again, most guys don't make it. That's the unfortunate truth. And guys have to have the opportunity to seize on their basketball potential when it's available to them. And that's a big benefit to coming into our system as opposed to the current one that's in place.
All right. Well, next we'd like to welcome our first guest on Forward Thinking, Soledad O'Brien, award-winning journalist, speaker, author, and philanthropist, also the CEO of SOB Productions, and advisory board member of the Professional Collegiate League. Soledad, thanks for joining us today.
Hi, thanks for having me. How's life? Self-isolation.
It's different, that's for sure. In fact, this very evening, this won't be available for a couple of days, but this very evening we were all supposed to be together in Atlanta, but unfortunately that wasn't to be. So
Nope.
Adapting as we all have to these days. So thank you again, though, for joining us. This is great. We had a lot of folks say that they still wanted to hear from you and the other guests that we had arranged for the event. And so we thought there was no better place to start than you.
It's my pleasure. Thanks for having me. And thanks for having me as part of the advisory board as well. I think in our first meeting, I said something like, what I know about the sport could fit on the head of a pin. But I'm really glad that you really clarified kind of what we're doing. And honestly, it's a real honor to be asked and to be part of this organization.
Well, thank you. Yeah, it's this, sports is only a small piece of this. We certainly don't stick to sports here. And, having somebody such as yourself being able to join and provide the incredible information that you're able to as it relates to whether it's production or social impact. And we're going to get into all the things you've done in your career and what you're currently working on. We can kind of dive right in. You've covered a lot of incredible stories and major stories throughout your life.
I've been around for a long time. I think that just happens over time. This is my 32nd year, which means that literally I have just ticked through. I used to interview Dr. Fauci about HIV/AIDS back in the day. And he was remarkable then. So it's very strange to see him. He's a little bit of the Energizer Bunny, continuing to talk about coronavirus and doing those briefings. He's a real asset, I think, to these conversations.
Absolutely. When he's allowed to participate. With that in mind, what really in the beginning, what drew you to the news?
The beginning, what drew me to the news was I was pre-med and I realized that I didn't want to be a doctor. So what drew me to the news was it was not medicine. And I didn't know what I was going to study after I decided not to go to medical school. I was taking organic chemistry with my sister, who's now a surgeon. And I just remember thinking, in fact, she said it to me, you're not passionate about understanding it. You're a good student, so you can memorize and regurgitate the things you need to know. But a scientist needs to want to understand. So I started working at a newsroom and I loved it. And I mean, I was getting people coffee and opening mail and answering phones. So, but it was all about multitasking. And I liked the idea of a show every day, trying to gather information and present stuff as fast as you possibly could, as accurately as you could. And then having the opportunity, if it went well or if it went badly, to do it all again the next day. And I really I think it was just an apprenticeship. So I started off literally removing staples from the wall at WPC TV, all 3 floors in Boston, which is a great sports town, obviously, and a great city for news. And then really trying to think about, what could I do? What was I interested in? And I loved reporting. I liked kind of being on the front lines of getting information, went to work in network news at NBC News, went to be a local reporter at KRON-TV in San Francisco, another great market to figure out how to be a reporter. Thank God it was before the internet, or really just as the internet was starting. So there was no kind of humiliation on social media for all the mistakes that I made. Merciful God. And then you kind of realize, like, storytelling and for me, I think elevating people's stories, right? Taking a point of view and not worrying about whether it was popular or not, but sort of saying this is a story that deserves attention and deserves to be told. I really found a lot of power in that. Like, I just really liked being able to do that.
You've covered a number of very powerful stories throughout the last couple of decades. Is
God,
there any
when you say it that way, I'm like, God, that's it. I'm out of here.
We found the moment. Is there any one or two in particular that when you think back on, you're really proud of what you guys were able to do from the storytelling perspective?
Yeah, I think Hurricane Katrina, we spent a lot of time in the city of New Orleans. And I think I was kind of, when I was a reporter locally, I was like a good, solid reporter, but I don't think I really connected the dots in trying to understand social justice and fairness. And so a lot of the stories that I covered, I think I just looked at like a woman. We had a lot of women actually who would kill their kids, and drown their kids. And I didn't think of it like what's happening in society, right? It was just like, wow, this person over here, terrible thing, it's crazy. Or this kid shoots this kid, or this mom's kid, this bad thing happens, as opposed to trying to think about a system that is failing people, or a system that's not working. And I think Katrina was the first time that I really, really, really fully understand. And I think I was a perfectly competent reporter, but understood that, like, if you thought you were reporting on a storm in Katrina, you were an idiot. You weren't. You were reporting on a failed system for a whole bunch of people who happened to be stuck in the aftermath of a storm. And I think it then dawned on me, like, wow, really explaining to people why some people can leave and why some people can't, why things happen, why do poor people live in the lower ninth ward? Why do some people live in high ground and some people live in low ground? I mean, it might sound so simplistic, but I don't think the news really, before that, thought about, these are American citizens and we really aren't getting supplies and help to them. And why not? What is the failure? Why are we failing American citizens? And so I think that was the first time that I really understood kind of the correlation of poverty and race and access and systems failing people. And so after that, we started doing documentaries, Black in America, Latino in America, where we do a deep dive into a community and I think try to connect the dots for people about access or how someone is perceived in a community and what the implications might be down the road. And I don't know that had been done a lot on network television or done outside a kind of a once every 10 years special. And so I think that for me was the first time that I became known for looking at social justice and issues of, how people are treated and how people live as very newsworthy and worth digging into, and not just the headline, but kind of the everything else around the headline, if that makes sense.
That makes a lot of sense. I want to say, before I get into my question, I was in New Orleans, during Katrina. And so that was a big, mental shifting moment for me as well, learning to the degree of which the city that I was living in, the desperation that existed in that city, which wasn't clear to me before Katrina. And, again, you go to New Orleans as a 21-year-old draft pick, you don't see it the same way as the reality, I guess, would show.
And also for me in news, that news could be of service, right? I felt like what we did very well. I remember we were coming back through the Baton Rouge airport, because obviously the main airport in New Orleans proper was closed. And we got a standing ovation. I remember I was discussing, we'd go in for 3 weeks and then come out. And I was dirty. My hair was gross. So I had a CNN baseball cap on. And I just remember people applauded us. And it was like, oh, crap. Like, if you actually serve people and push back and ask tough questions, and if you're the voice of people who can't get there, but they want to understand what's happening, like, that's the role. Do you not understand? Like, that's serving people, not just breathlessly reporting on a headline about a shooting and standing on someone's lawn saying, oh my goodness, this has just happened here. But really digging into information for people. I think that was the other piece for me. Like, oh shit, you could actually serve people. Like, that's the job.
Right. What's the most important part of telling stories, in your view, just in terms of how you contextualize some of the stories that you tell, and what goes into that decision making process? If I'm gonna tell this story, I choose to go with this narrative.
We're working on a story right now in Seattle. So we started shooting before the coronavirus, and then of course Seattle became the first city. We're doing a story on homelessness, and I think storytelling is about digging into an individual's, like getting the detail on one, right? It really is. But how do you, because it's a story about public health, it can't just be the story of one person, or it can't just be this one homeless family. It has to, again, be about the macro. What is happening to homeless people? What do you do for people who are in crisis when a crisis now hits? Another crisis layers on top. So that's the documentary we're shooting right now. So I think for me, good storytelling is, I always tell my staff, like, God is in the details. Like, if the woman waits in line for 17 hours, or she blows her tire and it's going to cost her $150, but she has $35.26, right? I want to know the detail, because that's what drags you into understanding someone's life, not the broad strokes. She had car trouble, or, oh, this thing happened over here. You need to feel and walk through people's challenges. And so for us, it's always God is in the detail, but then how do you undergird that with enough data that makes it relevant to the bigger story? It's not just this homeless family. It's interesting. So this family we've been following has been living in their car. They finally get housing. They're terrified because housing now means they're exposed to other people in the middle of the coronavirus crisis, right? And so being there when someone's having a panic attack about, like, I'm leaving my car, but is it now worse to not be, at least in your car, who you're around? It's a really challenging thing. And I think it's that. I think it's just God is in the detail, and you have to know a story well enough to really understand. It's not someone was married for a lot of years. I want to know exactly how many years and how many months and how many days, right? That's someone who can say, I've been married for 16 years, 4 months, and 8 days. That tells you a different story than, well, they've been married, almost 20 years. So I think it's just detail.
For those that might follow you on Twitter, which there's about 1.1 million people that do.
We're almost at 1.2 because I've been just aggressively going after people. I think that helps.
Yes, well, the rounding on Twitter, at least on our end, we can only see the 1.1 still, but good to hear. That context, I think, is probably one of the critical reasons why you have been, some would say, demanding of the mainstream media, of providing that context and of positioning stories in the appropriate way. What is, part of leaving CNN, going out on your own? You have all of these different things going on the entrepreneurial side now, which has allowed you to really say what you want to say.
I love journalism. I have to just tell you, I love journalism. I love storytelling. I love reporting. I love all of that. And I get to kind of dip my toes into documentaries and into a show. We do a show called Matter of Fact. That's a once a week kind of policy show. And obviously reporting for Real Sports for HBO. So I just feel like I have a lot of opportunities to kind of do what I want. What I like about Twitter is that you're unfiltered and you get to talk directly to people. And I do get very frustrated that a lot of the coverage right now about what's happening out of the White House is covered from the point of view of White House correspondents. So, for example, we're in the middle of a global pandemic. This is the worst public health crisis in 100 years. And yet everything is, who won the day? How did he seem? How did he come across? Did the president seem bold? Did he seem strong? Did he seem weak? Did he seem challenged, right? That's not how you cover a global pandemic. You don't allow misinformation. You inform people. And so I've been very frustrated that we keep taking live the president's pressers because they're full of misinformation and just out and out lies. And again, I think information is very important. Even wrong information needs to be seen in some capacity. But you have to frame it as in this thing is inappropriate, as opposed to taking it live and then after the fact saying, hey, that thing 30 minutes ago, oof, let me point out the 10 mistakes. I mean, that's just insane. And you wouldn't do it for anybody else. And I think the media just hasn't figured out how to cover mistruths and lies when they come from a very, the very top of the administration. There's just every day lots and lots of errors and inaccuracies. And I think when you're in the middle of a global pandemic, you do tremendous harm by allowing that to be platformed, right? When you're a national organization, you give your platform, right? If you bring someone and say, Soledad, let me introduce you to this person, you give of yourself to give that person credibility. So TV networks, I would argue, should stop carrying that live when you know it's full of mistruths and inaccuracy and lies. And you can carry it taped. You can frame it as this thing was wrong. Here's the president saying something that is untrue. Here's the president encouraging people to use a certain kind of drug that is unproven for people. Otherwise, I think it's very risky. And sometimes I do feel like I'm shouting into the wind a little bit because, listen, it's a ratings win for networks. And I don't know that they're ever going to say, do I turn away from a ratings win? So maybe that's just a waste of time to point it out. But I think it's a mistake.
Where would you, without getting into my own definition, I would love to know where or what do you make of the state of journalism today? The best way I can put it is I've always felt like journalism is the art form or is the actual job that people do to bring the masses or information, and the media was the mechanism by which journalists used to get and reach people and deliver their journalism. I guess that's the best. I'm just trying to figure out where you feel the state of journalism is today.
So I think for local news, it's a mess, right? Because there are just tremendous layoffs and it's unfunded, and most local reporters make almost no money. Incredibly, just not. And we've seen already in this crisis so many people who've lost their jobs. I think the challenge is that journalism has really figured out that they want to be entertainment, right? And the minute, it's a very easy test for me, which is, are you educating people? Are you serving people, right? Like literally, you could just say to yourself, are we serving people? Are we serving the people we say we're here to serve? Well, if you were serving people, you say, okay, so then we can't run this presser live, obviously, but we have to come up with another way. It's very important to have a record of what the president, by de facto, he's the president. We have to cover him in some capacity. We don't have to hand him a live mic to do it. We could delay it. We could frame it. We could do it differently. And so I think journalism is really struggling right now because they don't understand how to cover a person who really understands that having just the platform to bully, to make fun of people, to challenge people, and he really uses it very well. They're just not used to how it goes. And so they do this thing that giving platform to a lie. So if I run around and just give platform to a lie and run around all the national stations saying something that is untrue, there's a really large number of people who are going to just agree and believe me just by virtue of saying it. And I think that they haven't figured that out yet. So I'm constantly on people, certainly on Twitter. Like, you can't just say, the president says the moon is made of cheese. Like, that's a terrible tweet because there's a whole bunch of people who are going to say, oh, it's a fact. You're giving it a platform. You obviously are condoning it in some capacity. Whereas very easy to say, the president wrongly says. The president says the moon is made of cheese. Scientists disagree with him. They say the moon is made out of blah, blah, right? So, I'm using a very simple and silly example, but journalists have been very caught flat-footed. So you just have constantly this misinformation that's actually been elevated by journalists themselves because they don't understand that what this president does really well is publicity. This is really his strength, right? His PR. Right. And I think by getting a platform to be bombastic and aggressive, he's trying to kind of overtake the messaging. There was someone from the New York Times was writing, she was tweeting the other day. She said, President Trump says this experimental drug is worth pursuing. Dr. Fauci, who's the head of the National Institute of Health, says differently. Dude, I get this idea of these equivalents. David West says this about basketball. Soledad O'Brien feels differently. Who the hell cares what Soledad O'Brien feels about basketball. She's not an expert. Why would you even give her a second to elevate her take on a sport where she's not an expert? And I think that that's the challenge, is they just don't know how to deal with that. They just do not know how to deal with that. And that's really problematic, and we're paying the price for it.
Do you feel like in the last 3.5 years, and at least for the next 6 months or so, or 8 months, I guess, through the end of the year, that
every day is the same day, so it could be whatever. It's like Sunday, is it Monday, is it Tuesday, Thursday?
I never know anymore, and no
still
one
in sweatpants, same sweatpants.
But do you feel like the damage that's been done by this administration and the way that the media has sort of pandered to them, for lack of a better term, in a lot of cases, do you feel like that some of this damage is unfixable?
I think America's a really interesting place, and I don't think anything's ever unfixable, partly because this is a nation of people who have a lot of independence and an independent spirit, where they'll, for good and for bad sometimes. A whole bunch of people going off to church today with their independent spirit, where they should stay home and not be in a church. But, so I never think anything is not fixable. I think what's changed a lot is people have recognized, right, that platforming a lie is a really good strategy. It's a little bit like gaslighting people, right? As long as you say this other thing and you could say it enough times, it seems like it's true. There was a time, the media has this really interesting strategy of trying to make sense out of gobbledygook, right? So let's say if I were going to edit something that you said, I'd clean it up, right? I'd take out all your ums and bah, and I'd then serve to everybody, not whatever crazy thing you said. I'd serve like a cleaned up version of it. Well, that's what happens a lot. So you end up cleaning up what people have said. And I think people are beginning to realize, like, oh, I can say anything or do anything or kind of put forward information that's not really true. And now that has a certain amount of carriage because the media hasn't figured it out. So yeah, I think it's going to certainly be a short-term problem. I think it's damaging to journalism itself because I think there's a ton of lost trust in institutions as a whole. I don't think that when the Surgeon General tells people the president's in better shape than me, right? Like that's just, the man I believe he's one of those few people could pass like the Army fitness test.
Right.
So it's just an overt lie, right? So listen, when you do that, you undermine people's trust in you. They just think you are a full-on bullshitter. And does it matter today? Does it matter tomorrow? No, but it might matter in 6 months when you need people to believe something that you're saying. And I think that trust has really been eroded, and that's hugely problematic. Is it unfixable? No. Some people ask me sometimes, how does the media get back its trust? And I'm like, it's very much like, how do you get back your trust in a relationship? You just have to go do the right thing. Stop talking about it. Just go do it. Just do it. And then tomorrow do it again, and the next day. And then at some point, 2 years down the road, someone looks back and says, that person's really trustworthy. But you can't just talk about all that you're doing and tell people you're trustworthy. And I think that that's the problem. The media, again, has to go back people and not on one hand saying certain things are really important, but on the other hand, undermining their own point of view. And I don't think these things are any more complicated than that. Just have to do it. You have to say it. We're here to serve the public, and just do it.
In terms of getting to start your own banner, which originally Starfish Media Group, now SOB Productions,
which is sometimes Soledad O'Brien, because something's very serious. I feel like SOB is very sassy. I like, but which are obviously my initials. Someone gave me a lot of shit about that. They're like, "Why SOB?" I was like, "Soledad O'Brien, what's wrong with you?" But sometimes for very serious topics, it's actually Soledad O'Brien Productions. We sometimes shorten it to SOB. Yeah, it's been fun. I like it. I've enjoyed being a CEO, and I don't know that I knew what it meant my first year and a half.
And I'm guessing that's probably also why you have the apostrophe in your logo to make it more indicative of this is your initials. But so you guys just released a really, really good documentary, Hungry to Learn.
Yeah.
Was interested in terms of how that came together and what was your motivating factor to talk about this project, which is around food insecurity, particularly amongst college students. We were talking to a researcher, actually, a woman who's a professor, and she said that she had a bunch of journalism students, and they had a little journalism office, tiny. I mean, I'm trying to look like maybe 10 feet by 8 feet, little office. And she said one day she dawned on her that everybody was sleeping in the office, that people were sleeping there, that they couldn't actually afford housing. And so they were just sleeping in this journalism office, and she didn't know what to do. She didn't want to rat on them, but at the same time, she absolutely couldn't allow them
to stay in the office. And we started looking into research around how many students were housing insecure and food insecure. We met up with this researcher and we realized, and she said it actually, she said, we thought this might be a very sad story of a handful of students who just due to terrible circumstances couldn't eat. And then they did a poll in a huge number of academic institutions, and they've actually grown that number tremendously now from when that was 2 years ago. And they found that 50% of students claim to be food insecure at some point over the last 30 days. And she's like, oh my gosh, like that's an insane number. This is not a handful of students where, wow, that's just a sad thing. And so we decided to do a documentary that would look at 4 students as they try to navigate their experiences. One is a young Latino kid, 2 parents, they're just poor, paying off their own loans. He's in the military and he's trying to figure out how do you get through and not take on so much debt, but also make sure that you can afford your rent and to eat. One's a young woman who's homeless in New York City, living in a homeless shelter. One is a woman from the Midwest who's trying to navigate her family going through huge financial issues while also finishing college. And then another girl kind of in rural Pennsylvania whose parents are out of the picture who has to work. And you realize, I know these girls and the young man very well. Like this, they're not unusual. I wish I could say like the 4 of them, woo, we dug and found 4 really usual stories. It's not. For most students, it's really, really hard. There's a handful for whom their parents are paying for everything. But for most students, college is very, very expensive. And it's very hard to get some kind of aid to work and be able to feed yourself and pay for your housing. And so, especially if you grew up in a family where you sort of need college because you want to move out of the working poor, if you will, into a more solid career that's going to pay you better over the years, you really financially are stuck and struggling. Now, especially with coronavirus, it's a really challenging time. So it was a doc that looked at these students who are really remarkable in their efforts to get to and through, but just how hard it is. And some people said to me, well, everybody can eat, ramen going through college. And I was like, it's not really that. They don't eat. They literally do not eat any food. And they rely on all these food pantries. Interesting, even when I was touring colleges, my 2 daughters, one's a freshman now, one's just finishing her senior year. People point out the food pantry on campus, which I guess is great. But also, as a woman researcher in our doc says, like, food pantry is not the answer. A food pantry is just an indication that you have a problem you're trying to solve, but back to systems and not looking at food pantry. Whew, now some people who are hungry can eat. It's amazing, I think, that people donate their food and their time and their energy and their money to the food pantry, but it's also a very bad sign.
Yeah, I thought great, very well done, first of all.
Thank you.
Incredibly sad. I don't know that I was in the right state of mind to watch something like this. But one of the more interesting things I found was how you all talk about the food contracts that are on these campuses and how they are so valuable at this point that the contractors winning the bids then build sponsored and branded student centers driving traffic to these places where they are selling the food.
Well, and wellness centers, right? Because as you know, it's about a relationship, right? It's about kind of getting a toehold into an area. The thing that surprised me as someone who, when I was in college 75 million years ago, you just kind of waited in line with a plate and someone, plunked food onto your plate, was how much stuff costs. Like a sandwich is $10, $12, $8. It's expensive. And I live in New York City and I'm like, wow, that's kind of what, like if I went to a deli to get a sandwich every day as a working person making a salary, that's what it would cost me. $8 sandwich, a buck something for chips, a soda, whatever. You're looking at $10, $12, maybe $15 per meal. It's a lot of money when you're a student. And again, I think a lot of schools offer a meal plan that covers some meals, but not all meals. That's a little bit of a difference. And also, there's a little bit of an arms race for cafeterias, whereas people want to know. I'm looking at, schools with my daughter, right? They're like, this is the sushi bar. Over here on Tuesdays, we have, taco, make your own taco. Pizza night every Wednesday night, like food and how it's delivered and that it's now a social center versus everybody just eats whatever we make it's very different nowadays. And it's really how schools differentiate themselves. So the idea that the food providers are kind of jumping in to charge a lot of money for that food service, but also figure out if they can build a wellness building, what's the relationship that they can leverage off of, is not a surprise.
And not to get too far ahead of ourselves, because we're still going to get to the PCL, but talking about some of the misalignment that exists within college campuses, you also touched on in the project how the schools are not incentivized to change this because they're getting huge contracts from the contractors. And they're getting sponsored buildings built for them.
And school's expensive. And why would you want to pay? I mean, we have one scholar. We run a small foundation that sends girls to school. And they offered her 21 meals a month. 21 meals a month is nothing. I mean, now that we're all stuck at home in coronavirus, right? You're really like, oh, that's 1 week of meals. Okay, let's pretend you skip breakfast altogether. It's not that much. And this is a young woman who's in class 4 or 5 hours a day. It's really not conducive, and there's no other way to figure out how to fund it. So I do think that they have to really start looking at, when we give people aid, we have to think about how they're eating, and that no student should be hungry. I don't think anybody wants, whether they're an elementary school student or a college student, right? I mean, eating is kind of the baseline of what you need to be successful. And I do think it's really problematic. And these colleges are very, very expensive. Many of these students talk about they'll leave college in debt, $60,000, $70,000.
That's average that you guys touched on, $37,172.
And that's low for every single scholar who was every student who was in that doc. They're much more, they're all in the 60s. Those 4 are all in the $60,000. Some people can pay for it, right? And their parents are going to pay for it. But it's another way in which it just seems like the system is unfair. And we have to figure out ways to make the system work for everybody. I don't think anybody would argue, yes, some students should be hungry and some others, if their parents could pay, should not. That just sounds, I don't think anybody would agree to that.
Any projects coming up that you're able to talk to that you're excited about?
Yeah, so we're in the middle of shooting for Real Sports. We're on hiatus, of course, like everybody else with coronavirus, but we're doing a really interesting look. Probably, all the stories are sort of 12 to 15 minute long pieces that will look at the sport of hunting for pests, which means I got to try to figure out how to catch a python, which I would not recommend anybody do. And then, for matter of fact, we continue to take a look. This week we ran a doc about women who raise their children behind bars and actually get to petition the court to go to prison with their kids, because in Washington state, they were trying to figure out, could they lower recidivism if, in fact, they let the moms let the moms be good moms and recognize that a lot of these women who were incarcerated actually had drug problems or issues. And if you could solve for those issues, taking them away from their kids, maybe that wasn't the greatest strategy, helping them raise their kids. So that was an interesting project that aired today on Matter of Fact. So, it's been great. I'm glad to be out of the breaking news business, because I cannot imagine standing there in presidential pressers every day and really having a chance to kind of look at the longer view on what's happening in the world. So yeah, we've always got a lot of stuff cooking.
Just real quick, there's a couple questions.
Is that a little Tykes basketball net behind you? 2 of them?
Yep, 2 of them. My 10-year-old helped me design this.
I like it.
This little setup here. But I've got a couple questions. I always like to ask people who have achieved. I believe that experience is one thing, but actually like accomplishing and achieving things throughout your journey means something. And the first question I want to ask is, was there a fail up moment for you somewhere? Personally, I had one. I was a senior in high school and I failed. I flunked out. I couldn't walk with my graduating class in 1998. Had to go to military school, which I hated. It was literally like the most miserable year of my life. But it was exactly what I needed, because everything from that moment of failure, everything just went up. So I'm curious if you had one of those moments where you failed up.
I would say when I was anchoring at CNN, I got fired from my anchor job. I was anchoring with a guy named Miles O'Brien. So it was the 2 O'Briens. And I remember we had just finished covering, it was such a busy year, Pope died that year. It must have been the Katrina year. And I got fired. And it was offered to me to start doing documentaries. And, and the way it works when you're fired from anchoring is that you're fired, but you have to stay on the air. And they actually don't tell you until it runs in the New York Times. So it's like humiliation piled on humiliation. Like you're anchoring and people are like, girl, I just read this article.
Right.
It's the worst. And I remember thinking, like, Dick Parsons at Time Warner called me and he said, so how are you doing? And I was like, I'm doing okay. And he said, so this documentary thing, can you make it work? And I was like, you know what? I think I can make it work. And he goes, good. I think you can too. And I just remember thinking, like, I've always been good at, if plan A doesn't work, go to plan B. And it was so humiliating. I mean, literally, you're on the air and you get to do a little speech at the end. I just want to thank the crew and whatever at the end of the week. But to make a turn and go right to documentaries, which would actually be the thing that would allow me to start my own company, 5 or 6 or 7 years later, ended up being incredibly valuable. But at the time, it just felt like, oh my gosh, this is awful. And humiliating and the worst. And I mean, you can't fail more than that. And it's public, right? So, your kids are like, Mommy, did you get fired? Like, yeah, yes, I did. And so I often tell that story because I try to let people know, I mean, it sounds so cheesy, but it is that when a door closes, kind of a window opens. I think I looked at the doc thing as, all right, well, let's see what this could be. And by doing it well and getting a good reputation in doing documentaries, it really changed my career trajectory. It allowed me eventually to be able to start a company because we would be able to create content, sometimes docs, but often we do a lot of series. So we have a series for HBO, we have a bunch of series for Discovery. Like, it just allowed me to stop doing daily news and to do something else and to do it well. At the time, it felt like the biggest mess and embarrassment ever. And so I think it's really important for people to realize, like, the horrible thing might actually be the good thing if you can keep on track with what you're trying to get out of it and making sure that you don't spend all your time mired in, this is horrible, this is horrible, this is horrible. And instead, what's on the other side of really embarrassing or really horrible.
Absolutely. Again, that embarrassment part, I mean, here I am, like the state player of the year in North Carolina, and then it's like, he's not going to graduate high school. It was hard those next couple months, just sort of like everybody looking at me like, man, you didn't graduate.
Right?
You didn't graduate high school, man. That was like, there was no lower point for me, in terms of at that point in my life. So, and then the second one is, it's a lighter question, but in the morning, I grew up, I was born in 1980, so I came through college.
You were born in 1980?
1980.
I wouldn't even tell you what year I was born.
When were you born?
1989.
I was born in 1966. Oh. But I'm going to tell everybody I was born in 1986. Carry on.
There you go. But I came through particularly the last couple years of the 90s, inner yoga, mindfulness, all this stuff started, right? And I'm somebody that's I bought into it to a degree, but I've always, from that era, I would say, people started doing things and really focusing on the morning, right? When I was in college, it was all about like sleeping. And then all of a sudden it's like, no, you need to wake up in the morning. You need to start your day at like 5:30. And people started falling into these different routines. So my simple question is, when you wake up in the morning, is there something that you do every single morning that sort of gets you balanced, that you might be willing to share with us?
Yeah, and I think morning routine is really, really important. It's been weird on this coronavirus thing, right? That all of our routines are kind of messed up. Normally, I get up at like 5 or 5:30. Try to go to bed relatively early, 9 o'clock or something. But I try to get 8 hours of sleep. And there was a time when I thought if you got 4 hours of sleep or 5 hours of sleep, you were killing it. And I think I'm just, a lot of brain science is, no, actually, you need 8 hours of sleep. So I go to bed earlier. I tend to get up in the morning and then I try to work out first thing because I'm lazy. And if I don't do it first thing, and I have a protein shake because I'm trying to be a vegan. And I'm kind of a cheating vegan at times. But I find kind of like if you start off eating well and getting your workout out of the way and then making your to-do list, you literally have accomplished 86% of what you need to get done.
Right.
It kind of just keeps me on track. And I'm a Virgo and we tend to be tightly wound and, I walk around literally with my lists in my house and yelling at my
Never do.
children to get certain things done.
Right.
But I always felt like you had to start early and just tick shit off your list. If I did what I did in college, which was, roll out of bed at 10:30 or 11, then forget it.
Right,
Like you're
right.
wouldn't even get done. So I agree with you. I think your morning routine, and they often have a lot of successful CEOs, like Warren Buffett. What does he do in the morning? And he reads like 8 books, before 9 a.m. or something crazy. I don't do that, but I definitely try to like start my day and stay on track. And I think if you could eat well and you could just knock out some exercise, you've gone a really long way to a good morning.
Absolutely. That's 2. Let's dunk it home. There we go.
That didn't seem very hard. That doesn't seem like it's as high as it should be.
No, it's just my arms are incredibly long. But
That's what happens when you're 6'9".
Yeah, right.
All right. Well, so now shifting gears again, Professional Collegiate League, for those of you, this might be the first time you've ever heard about it. Soledad, you're on our advisory board. And there might also be a little something going on with SOB Productions and the PCL. But so in general, what's drawn you to sports and what drew you to us?
I think what drew me to you guys was this idea of justice and fairness. And again, looking at systems and how systems are working for people or not working for people, how students cannot figure out how to be compensated for something that's being built on their back seems incredibly unfair. And when you look and dive into those arguments, they're terrible arguments. They never ever work, right? And you see, CBS News or CBS or any of the networks making tons of money off of college sports, and the students themselves, in fact, get in a lot of trouble if they try to make any money off of their own names, their own likeness. So, and the rules are obviously very stringent. So I like the idea of how could you fix a system, really taking a systemic approach to create something new that would both help students who want to pay and compensate them, put education front and center so that it wasn't a, wink, wink, we really don't care if they graduate or not. I spent a lot of time covering certainly basketball players who financially, was really challenging for them. They need the money. And how could they figure out how to get compensated for what they were doing? So I love the idea of a systemic approach to making things fair and just for students, but not bother to educate people and just make them professional players, but pretend they're college players. I think that happens a lot, that kind of like, we're going to pretend thing. And so that's why I was very interested in being involved. My involvement in sports, I played rugby in college. It's why I'm missing an ACL in my right leg. And my dad was a professional athlete. He was a professional rugby player. He played for Australia in the 50s. And so I was not a sports maniac, but I was okay at sports. I'm decently athletic. I do a lot more horseback riding now. I think my sports that I deal with now are my boys are very into sports, and my kids go to a school where they have to play sports. My daughter is a really fantastic diver and has been a very successful high school diver, winning a bunch of competitions. My other daughter, I would say she is present and accounted for on the field hockey field. My husband and I watching field hockey, we're like, what the hell is this game? How do you, what happened? I never knew. We got through it and we just never really learned the rules of field hockey ever. But I did love a place, and I actually love any school where kids have to compete, right? They have to do, in my kids' school, they have a sport 3 times a year. They have to pick a sport. And so usually there's a sport you love and you're good at. And then the other 2 semesters, a lot of stuff you're not good at and you don't love. And I like that, showing people that you don't have to be great, that you can still compete. You can compete and you can deliver a lot, and you can be on the varsity or the JV, or even they have a thirds team, and sometimes they have a fourths team, and everybody can still contribute and help build something. It's not always about, hey, if you're not the very, very best, don't bother. And
Right.
So I've lived through field hockey, diving, lacrosse, squash, basketball. My boys actually play a lot of lacrosse, and that's the sport that they really, really, really love. Soccer is another one. And so it's fun to see them in the sport that they love. Spent a lot of time watching that, and my husband played lacrosse in college. And then, other sports that were just present there while it's unfolding around us. And my daughter she was actually the one who's a diver, was a pretty decent athlete, but she hated soccer so much that she'd do handsprings off on the sideline. My husband's like, I cannot watch this child not be committed to her sport. I think diving was the first time she really found something that she loved. But I love sports. I love sports for not for sports. I love sports for what it builds in people. I
Right.
love that it challenges you. I love that it forces you to be around people who you might not ever pick as your friends. I
Yeah.
like that it makes you work toward a common goal, and that you get a whole lot out of losing, sometimes even more than winning. And the story of coming back is a very, it's a little bit of a hero's journey. We did a doc on a boxer during when women's boxing was in the London Olympics the first time, a boxer named Marlena Esparza. And she lost her match. And I just remember we went to shoot her a couple of days later, and she was in mourning. She had not lost a match in 13 years.
Whoa.
And then all of a sudden, then one day she gets up and laces up her sneakers and goes for a run. And you're like, and she's back. She would end up winning a bronze medal in the Olympics, and we got to go on this journey with her, right? But it's about, do you allow yourself to be defeated? And you can be in fourth squash, or you can be an Olympic boxing hopeful, and you're still challenged to, what does it mean for you to show up and stand up and try again and be defeated and come back? I mean, I just think it's such a great metaphor for every big challenge. It's why I love Real Sports on HBO, right? Because it's the prism of sports as looking through stories is so fascinating. It's not the how do you score it, how do you win, how do you lose? I mean, who cares about that? It's the what kind of person can come through the other end.
Right.
And the person who you thought could do it sometimes can't. And the person who you counted out completely sometimes can. And that, I think, is so inspirational and informs all the rest of us who are just trying to get through. So I love sports as a prism.
So, as any lawyer should do when there's not a judge overlooking them, I'm going to ask a leading question here. The argument that a college experience and education would be diminished by compensation, so specifically for a college athlete. As a pre-med and as a journalist while you were in college, do you feel like if you were being paid for your craft, that it would have in any way taken away from your college experience?
No, it's a completely absurd point, Your Honor. It's obviously absurd. I know it's a leading question, but it's ridiculous. And when people talk about how it's going to take away from your experience, it doesn't even make sense. I think for so many of these student athletes, they are working so hard and they spend so much time actually on the sport that it's just amazing to me. I mean, when we have one young woman who played basketball at Georgetown. I know several others. It's so much that I think for them compensation would help relieve some of the pressure. And I think even people who argue the opposite of that really understand it. I mean, listen, I think this entire thing is trending this way. It is just unfair. It is just unfair. Even the people who are arguing against it, you look at them and you're like, yeah, they know it's just unfair. So no, of course it wouldn't detract from their experience, whatever that word experience means. Obviously not.
Last thing we wanted to touch on, again, obviously we are doing this remotely and not in person as we all wanted to do.
6 feet, baby. I don't want anybody near me.
Throughout this period of social isolation, obviously you have your family and you guys have probably hopefully got to have some quality time together. Is there any hobbies?
So much quality time. So much.
Are there any hobbies that you've really gotten to sort of reconnect with or do every day that maybe your schedule doesn't usually permit you to do?
Yeah, it's such a weird question, right? Because it's sort of like, what's been the upside of being socially isolated? And I will say every day around 5 o'clock, my husband takes the boys out to play lacrosse with them. And that's amazing to watch because often it doesn't happen. We live in New York City usually, and he never gets out of work before 5 o'clock, right? So this idea of just the kids being able to do that with their dad every day is awesome. And I know that they love it. And I like, it's right outside of my bedroom window. So I get to watch it happening and it's great. And I think, we also kind of cook as a family. I'm a terrible cook and I hate cooking, but I hate it, but I'm also bad at it. And my daughter is fantastic. So I'm a cleaner. I will clean, I will scrub all the dishes and I'll put stuff away and I can take direction. I'll chop onions and slice things. But dinner has become kind of a family, what are we going to have tonight? How do we pull it together? And then so, my husband travels a lot. I travel a lot. And this idea of like being stuck in a place and you can't travel and you can just hang out and play checkers and some other silly board games and make long dinners and play sports with the kids in the backyard. I mean, parts of that have been, my husband and I were just talking about it as we went on a long walk together today. Usually don't get a lot of time to do. Like, it's been really pleasant to spend a lot of time with the kids and not have to, say, listen, I got to wrap this up because I've got to get to the airport, or, oh, I'm not going to be able to make it. I'm going to come to this game, but I'm going to run in and run out. It has probably made me really rethink how much travel I do and kind of slowing down and how do you think about doing that. So I think a lot's going to change after this. This will end. We will not be so socially isolated forever. I think people have grasped technology enough that we'll have more meetings like this because everyone will say, I want to hang out with my kids. So let's do a Zoom call and not get on a plane where we're all hanging out eating, but none of us get to hang out with our kids. So I think it's going to change a lot of things, actually.
Do the board games get competitive amongst the family? It sounds like you got a lot of athletes mixed in there.
It's so funny. Do you know what's competitive? My husband. He's disguised as a non-competitive person, but he wants to win. I don't care because I'm usually running around, so someone is always like rolling the dice for me. Yeah, it gets messy. We also there's so many weird games now, like memes. There's games about memes, and some of them are like, we played a game the other day that was very off color, and I think my poor children were so embarrassed with playing a game with their mom. It was like identifying memes, and some of them were like little raunchy, and my boys were like, I can't do it. Like, we can't.
I know the game you're talking about. Yeah.
This is supposed to be a game with like 10, 16-year-old boys, not mom, your older sister. So that's been our bigger challenge. We have not gotten into Scrabble, which I am kind of a killer at. I have a degree in English literature. I think I can win at Scrabble. So that's what I'm waiting for.
Our last two things on the socially distanced front. Any binge-worthy shows? I know last time we saw each other, you told me like only on airplanes. That's like the only time.
So my sister is going through a divorce, and I went to spend some time with her, and she started watching this show on Netflix called Call the Midwife. This is going to be the worst description of a show ever, but I'm telling you, it's such a good show. It's on Netflix. Also, it has a lot of episodes because I think it has 8 seasons at 20 episodes per, so 1 million. So every night, because she was kind of emotionally a bit of a mess, she'd sit down and we'd watch together 2 episodes of Call the Midwife, which is about, in the 1950s, the National Health Service started in Great Britain, and they created this midwife service to help women who were having babies. And it's the most emotional, it's the greatest show ever. People are like, what? But it's really good. It's called Called Midwife. So I'm very into that. Everybody's watching Tiger King. I just don't think I need that kind of drama in my life. It just seems like too much. It's not really a documentary. It's a lot of recreations, right? So not that one. And now I was obviously Criminal Minds is my favorite show on television, but I've seen, that was 20 seasons, 15 seasons, some ridiculous number. And again, 20 something episodes per. So I've seen every one, some of them twice. So I've moved on to NCIS. I need like for me, television entertainment has to be very mindless. It can't be complicated. Oh my God. What was the one that everybody was watching that I hated? Oh, it was terrible. It just was so complicated following the storylines. I'm like, I have to be able to, too much.
Scandal, I think when you mentioned,
So it has to be mindless, simple, and you can walk away and come back and have missed nothing. That's the kind of show I need. It's been working very well for me.
I think David would probably recommend The Office to you.
Well, right. We've all seen, how great is that?
Right.
You can walk away and come back. It's all good.
Right.
All right. And then my last question, I know my wife and I, we've talked about this, and I'm sure you've probably at least thought about it. What's the first thing that you want to do when we get the all clear from medical professionals?
I have a couple of friends who are going through some tough times. I really would like to be able to hug them. I miss hugging people. I miss being able to greet somebody with a hug, and I'm a hugger. And I miss being able to hug people and hug on people and not scare them. And I think that's the hardest part of social distancing, right? Waving to someone is not the same. So I feel really lucky because we have a big family. I have 4 kids and then my husband, right? So our house is full. My best friend lives alone, and I think it's kind of lonely, especially because you can't really touch anybody. So I'm just going to run around and hug people, and I'm going to creep a lot of people out. I'll be like, hey, come here, baby. But that's what I'm going to do.
Thank you. It's been great Pleasure to
was
meet you. I've been a fan for a good time since 1986.
Thank you.
Whatever.
It was my pleasure. So nice to chat with you both.
All right.
Thank you so much for joining us.
Of
and
course.
we look forward to finding a way to remotely recreate the panel discussion that we would have had soon.
Absolutely. Or just doing it together one of these days when we're all allowed out.
All right. Well, stay 6 feet apart and stay safe. And thank you again for joining us.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me. Take care, you guys.
All right.